Welcome to another exciting podcast of Royal Oak Victory Church. We're glad you've joined us. We are a community devoted to God, connected to others, and influencing our world.
Well, it was interesting this week. I was just standing in my office upstairs, and I noticed a picture on my shelf, and it was a picture of my kids. And as is often the case, we get familiar with the stuff that's around us, and we kind of forget a little bit about what some of the things in our homes and our offices are all about. But for some reason, this picture caught my attention this week. And it was about 4 years ago that this picture was taken, so my kids were quite a bit younger. But it was really that change aspect, the fact that it was 4 years old and seeing how much they had grown and changed in 4 years, the fact that my youngest wasn't even in the picture, and just how much change can happen in such a relatively short period of time. And yet we get into these moments, and like I said, we get familiar, and really that 4 years has gone by so very quickly. And it got me thinking about how time is funny that way, how time can play on us, where sometimes periods will feel like they go so fast, and other times it seems like they drag out. And as I was thinking about that, I thought, you know what, this would be a fun little experiment to do, to go back 38 years to the year 1981, to see if you guys remember any of these things that happened 38 years ago. Some of you might not want to remember what happened 38 years ago, but we want to go through this. In fact, some of you might be too young to even remember 1981. But I do want to go through these just to kind of draw your attention to what was happening 38 years ago. One of the first things that happened is we had what was called the metrification change in Canada. So gasoline began to be sold in liters instead of gallons. We began to move towards the metric system. Unless you're my dad, who's still convinced that never happened. He grew up in the imperial system, and he refuses to change. It will always be that way. But got another amen over here. And that was one of the things that changed in 81. We made this shift. Another momentous occasion for us here in Calgary is the 88 Olympics were awarded to Calgary in 1981. And that started that 7-year process for us as a city as we move towards the preparation for the Olympics. Now, the one thing that I find really funny about those Olympics is that I am from Calgary. I grew up in Cochrane, and I never went to the Olympics. My wife grew up in North Dakota, and she did go to the Olympics. I still haven't figured out how that happened, but for another time, maybe. The average price of a new home in Canada was $78,000. I miss those prices. Of course, we also have to remember that interest rates in 1981 were 14%. So when we hear 4 or 5% nowadays, we should be thankful. Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, and Pierre Trudeau was prime minister here in Canada. The top movie was Raiders of the Lost Ark. Anybody seen Raiders of the Lost Ark? Yeah, classic. Indiana Jones. Another thing that happened that year is that Prince Charles and Lady Diana were married in 1981. And NASA launched its very first space shuttle mission. Of course, the space shuttles have now been retired, but that was the first one, Space Shuttle Columbia in 1981. Now, one of the weird things about 1981, something we take for granted, was invented and released in 1981, and that's Post-it notes. They were invented and released in 1981. The other thing that was kind of invented and released was IBM's first personal computer. This is it here. We always just make fun of having to use these drives, the little floppy disks, and this generation has no clue what it meant to pull one of those out, shake it, blow on it just to try and get it to work. Dustin and I were talking this week about how there's more memory on his little tiny memory card he has for his camera than my hard drive had on my computer. And I still remember my first computer had a 40 megabyte hard drive, and my dad said I would never be able to fill it. I think I've got more, well, I definitely know I've got more than 40 megabytes on my phone. Things have changed. One of the things that I found very interesting when I was doing this is what the fashion trends in 1981 were. I remember some of this. Now, I have to say, the women aren't too bad, but I don't think I'd ever be caught in this stuff. An embroidered shirt and those, oh my gosh, I'm just gonna leave it as is. And then the toys that were at the forefront in 1981 were what we see here. Now, the thing I find very interesting is a lot of these Fisher-Price toys are being re-released as classics. 38 years ago, and they're already classic. But they're bringing them back, and it's just interesting to see what can happen, right? Now, you may not want to answer this question. Does anybody remember this stuff? 1981, a few of you in the room. You're willing to admit it? I was alive in 1981, but I don't remember much from 1981. I was still pretty young, but I do remember some of that stuff, probably more so this page than anything. But what got me thinking about this not only was the picture, but this idea that our world moves at such a fast pace. That sometimes it's good for us to take a moment here to reflect and realize what's going on, because sometimes the stuff moves so quickly that what is going on around us, the things that are so fleeting for us, become very easily secondary concern for us. We rush to work, or we rush to school. We rush to get the kids somewhere, whether it's sporting activity or dance or whatever it is. We during the summers here, we rush on a Friday afternoon to get out of the city as fast as possible to find the best camping spot. It's always just a rush, and whatever it is, we rush and we rush and we rush, and we fail to see what the quote so famously points out, is that we need to stop and smell the roses. But not only do we not notice what is happening around us or what's moving around us, I also wonder, when we set a pace like this, how easy it is for us to fail to hear what God is trying to tell us. Whether he's drawing us closer, or whether he's wanting to give us freedom and guidance and wisdom. Maybe he wants to reveal his grace and his truth to us. Or maybe he is asking us to do something that will provide healing and breakthrough. And just because of the pace that we move at the speed that we move at, we're missing his voice. And when we do that, in those moments when we miss out not only on what's going on around us, but we also miss out what's going on inside of us. I know I have found myself caught in that situation in those seasons in life where time just blurs by, and you look back and you go, where did the last year go? Where did the last month go? Right? Anybody been in those moments? Right? I think we all have, where things just move so quickly. And it's in hindsight that we look back and go, man, I wish I had paid more attention. And it's all the more true for us when God is calling us to something. Maybe he's calling us to something different, or to something deeper, or even to something life-changing. We just have to be willing to slow down to try and see what he's trying to do. We need to slow down and maybe be humble enough to see what he's showing us, to slow down enough for us to see the signs. And so, as Paul has mentioned, we're going to continue on in our series today, and I want to challenge you to be open to hear what God is saying into your situation, to slow down a little bit, to take this moment to pause, and to understand the deeper things that he's trying to do. Over the course of the summer, we have been moving through a series of messages specifically about the book of John, and even more so, the 7 miracles that John outlines in his book in a series we've called Marvel at the Miracles of Jesus. A couple of weeks ago, we started this series off, and we talked about Jesus' first miracle, how he turned water into wine, and how that miracle was a launching point for his ministry, how that started the clock towards his crucifixion. But even more than that, how this practical and compassionate action at a wedding with friends and family was a sign that really revealed or foreshadowed what was to come. And that was through his death on the cross, we had the establishment of a new covenant and a replacement of the old. Changing water to wine, changing old to new. And then last week, Sheldon, as one of our elders, he shared with us about the healing of the official son. He showed how this sign revealed to us the potency and power of Jesus' very word, and how our obedience to it is tied and connected to our faith. And today I want to look at his third miracle that John outlines, his third sign as he refers to them. And so I want all of us in your Bible, turn with me to John chapter 5. John chapter 5. If you have an app, we're going to be reading out of the New King James Version today. Just as a reminder, as you're turning there, John outlined to us later in his book why he wrote his book. We have to remember that John is very different than the other four Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are much more of historical accounts, whereas John has a specific purpose and a specific reason why these 7 signs or these 7 miracles are in his book. And he actually says it in chapter 20, verse 31. He says, "But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." And we see as well in Jesus' life that he himself responded in much the same manner when asked that question. We see over in Matthew chapter 11, you don't have to go there, we'll stay in John 5, but John the Baptist had just been arrested, he was in prison, and he started to hear about all these things that Jesus was doing. And so he sent his disciples to Jesus, and they asked a very simple but interesting question: are you the one we're waiting for, or is there another to come? And Jesus responded like this. He said, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them." Basically, Jesus was saying, the proof is here. The proof is in the pudding. The proof of my divinity can be seen through my actions. Basically, Jesus was saying exactly what John is saying, is that when we look at these signs, when we look at these miracles, we realize who Jesus was. And so with that in mind, let's pick up our story. John chapter 5, we're going to start right in verse 1. It said, "After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had." Now I want to stop there because some of you, if you're not in the New King James Version, will have noticed that that last sentence isn't in your Bible. Verse 4 doesn't appear in the oldest of the manuscripts we have of the book of John, and so most of the newer translations exclude it. They feel like it was a scribe that probably wrote it in the margins, and somebody just assumed that was part of the text and added it later. And so either there's a note in your Bible saying, here's this story, or they just exclude it altogether. But for us, it's important to take this into account. Although maybe John didn't write it, it does give us cultural context as to what was happening in this location, this pool of Bethesda. And so I've chosen to just leave it in today to give us that context. Now, what we also know is that this pool was fed by an underground spring. And so it wasn't an angel that would stir up the water. The spring would surge on once a year or once in a while occasion, and that would cause the waters to ripple. So while we can explain it from a natural understanding, a scientific understanding, it's important that we understand this section of the passage so we know what's about to happen and why it happens. So that note on verse 4. Now we're going to continue in verse 5. It says, "Now a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he already had been there in that condition a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up. But when I am coming, another steps down before me." Next. There you go. Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed and walked. And that day was the Sabbath. The Jews therefore said to him who was cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed." He answered them, "He who made me well said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" Then they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" But the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you." The man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. For this reason, the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath. So in this story, we see this miracle, and what we really see is that Jesus is calling us into deeper relationship. And the way he shows this, the way he exhibits this, is through the compassion that he shows. So the first and most obvious act of compassion we see from Jesus is his compassion for the one, his compassion for this man. Now, we don't know how much time has passed exactly from the healing of the official son until this moment, because John doesn't tell us what feast this is that they're celebrating. But we do know that Jesus was following the requirements of the law, and he had gone up to Jerusalem, he had gone up to the temple to do what he had to do during that feast. Now, note, most people who are coming to Jerusalem and most people who were going up to the temple would have gone through one of the main gates. Now, we need to make it very clear that the sheep gate that is referred to here by John is not one of the main gates. This gate is what you would expect it to be. This was the gate for the animals, the ones that were brought for sacrifice. So you would bring up your sacrifice, you would pass it over to the priests, and they would take your animal in for sacrifice, and you would then make your way in through one of the other main gates. What we also know is that this entrance, this sheep gate, was near this pool that John calls Bethesda. Now, all that being said, it's important for us to know that because John clearly says Jesus went to the pool near the sheep gate. Jesus was being intentional. You didn't go to this gate on purpose, and you especially didn't go to this pool on purpose. This was an area reserved for those that were sick. This was an area reserved for those that were infirm. Really, this was a place that people put those that were sick so they could forget about them. Out of the way, ignored. John describes it as having 5 porches. And we know from archaeological evidence, because they discovered the pool of Bethesda about 60 years ago, that this place was absolutely massive. And it was just as John described it to be. It would have been about 60,000 square feet. To give you some sort of context, that's about 7 or 8 times larger than this auditorium. And so when John describes it as a place where there was a great multitude of those that were sick, we begin to grasp what Jesus was walking into. You imagine a room that's 7 or 8 times this size, filled with the sick, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed, and the infirm. It really was a place to forget about. And yet Jesus intentionally and specifically went there. Jesus then approaches this one man. He finds out that he's been infirm, that he's been there for a long time. He's been there for 38 years. And he asks him this question: do you want to be made well? Now, from our little experiment earlier, we can see that a lot can happen in 38 years. A lot of time has passed. And Jesus specifically approaches this man who would have been there for so long. He would have heard and seen so much. And while 38 years doesn't seem like a very long time, for this man it would have been an eternity. 38 years being sick and infirm. And yet Jesus comes along, and this man is obviously in distress. And he asks him, "Do you want to be made well?" And I have to wonder what Jesus was thinking when he asked this question. I mean, isn't that obvious? This guy's been there for 38 years. He's been there for such a long time. Wouldn't it be fairly obvious that this guy wants to get better? But Jesus asks the question, "Do you want to be made well?" And look at how the man responds. He says, "The sick man answered him, 'Sir, I have no man to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up. But when I am coming, another steps down before me.'" So rather than answering yes, he makes excuses. He blames his situation and his lack of help on his inability to be healed, his inability to get to the pool. He even has Jesus standing right in front of him, and immediately he goes, "Well, I can't get into the water." He puts his blame on everything and anything else. And in fact, he's so stuck in that superstitious tradition of the water that he fails to recognize who is in front of him. And while I admit that at first I didn't understand this guy's response, when I took a moment to slow down, to listen to what Jesus was saying here, to the question he was really asking, the surprise diminished for me, and I realized how easily each of us does the same thing. Jesus calls us to something more, or to something deeper, or to something greater. Maybe he calls us into an action that will inspire healing or will cause breakthrough. And rather than responding with an emphatic yes, we make excuses. We blame others. We don't do what he's asking us to do. We have Jesus standing right in front of us, offering hope and salvation for our situation, offering hope and release from our difficult circumstances, for freedom from our fears and doubts, and yet we continue to look at either superstition or our own strength. Really, we're not that much different than this man. And yet Jesus, in all of his compassion, responds to us in the same way that he responded to this man. He said, "Rise, take up your bed, and walk." Even though this man comes forward with excuses, even though he comes forward with blame, Jesus doesn't allow for that. He doesn't allow the excuses, the blame, or the pride to control the situation, but instead, he provides a compassionate instruction on how breakthrough will happen. He extends the invite and asks him to do the seemingly impossible. Can you imagine what this man might have been thinking in that moment? I have been sick, I have been infirm for 38 years. And you just want me to rise? To get up, to walk, to pick up my bed? Do you know how impossible that is? Don't you think I would have tried already? Don't you think I would have done that? For 38 years, he hasn't been able to do what Jesus is now asking him to do. But the thing we have to remember is in him, the impossible becomes possible. I'm going to say that again. In him, the impossible becomes possible. And this man must have recognized this because Jesus says to him, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." And he responds. Jesus asks him to do an impossible thing, to rise in that moment, to stand up. But what I love is that he doesn't just say stand up. He says, pick up your bed and go. So what he was telling the guy is not just can you stand, not just am I going to heal you, but you have no chance of relapse because I'm not giving you an option in this. I'm not going to let you sit in your excuses and allow you to think, oh, my bed is there, I can go back to it. It's time to rise, to pick up your bed and walk. And in walking, he's outlining an expectation of continued success. This isn't just about a singular moment. I expect you to walk this out for the rest of your life. Verse 9, and immediately, we should be saying that together. And immediately, let's try it again. And immediately the man was made well. Immediately the man was made well. He took up his bed and he walked. So the question I have for you today is, what bed is Jesus asking you to pick up? What situation is he calling you to rise, to take up and walk? What thing is holding you back? What thing is Jesus saying, you know what? Enough is enough. No more excuses. It's time to rise, to take up, and to walk. I'm not going to allow you to hold yourself back any longer. All you have to do is rise, take up, and walk. No more excuses. No more blame. Immediately, we respond. Because how many know that if Jesus gives you the power to rise, he will also give you the power to do it every day? That's what causing the impossible to turn into the possible is all about. It's not a one-time thing. It's an everyday thing. It's not like Jesus says, rise, and that's it. He says, rise, take up, and walk, because he gives you the strength to do it every day, to bear our cross every day. Amen? That is the power and the compassion of his desire for the one, not just the one man in this story, but the one that is each and every one of us. And he's calling you today to do the same thing. What is your bed? It's time to pick it up and to walk. It's time to pick it up and walk. But as we continue on in this story, there's a stark reality that causes me to wonder at the compassion of Jesus. I mean, sure, he had compassion on the one. This guy had been there for 38 years, but in a place that was filled with the lame and the blind and the sick, 60,000 square feet of people that he could have healed, Jesus heals only one. John tells us that because there were so many sick people there, that after he heals this man, Jesus leaves. That doesn't make any sense to me. Yet if we remember the reason John writes that every miracle is a sign, we also realize that every action of Jesus had a purpose. There was a reason behind him only healing the one. And while the healing of the one man truly was miraculous, we could stop at that point. We could do an entire message just on that piece. We also need to realize that Jesus ultimately did not go to that place to heal that one man. And when we understand that purpose, we realize how compassionate Jesus really was. We see it in verse 9 when John writes this, and that day was the Sabbath. Jesus just didn't heal the one man out of compassion for the one. He healed that one man because of his compassion for the many. You see, Jesus went into that place with the express purpose of challenging the religious rulers of the land. That their idea, their misconstrued interpretation on the importance of the Sabbath was wrong. Now, just to give us a refresher, the Sabbath was a designated day of rest. It was established in the law, just as God had created the earth in 6 days and took a day to rest. He told his people to do the same thing. Work and toil for 6, rest for 1. But over the course of the years, the religious rulers had time to interpret what this word work meant. And they had added all of these restrictions, all of these things you couldn't do of what entailed work, to the point where the Sabbath no longer was a day of freedom, but is a day of restriction. It wasn't one of rest, but instead one of worry and fear that you might be breaking the law. Jesus, in his compassion, wanted to change all of that. And he did it by challenging the authorities on what they thought was really important. The religious leaders may have had their minds in the right place. We're going to honor God by honoring the law. But somewhere along the way, they had lost the heart. They had lost the purpose, the reason. We see this so clearly in how they responded to the healing of this miraculous healing of this man. It said the Jews, and that being the leaders, therefore said to him who was cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed." He answered them, "He who made me well, said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" Then they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Are you kidding me? Here's a man that has been sick and infirm, basically paralyzed for 38 years, and now he's walking in front of them, carrying his bed, and they're worried that he's doing work. They didn't celebrate the healing. They didn't acknowledge the miraculous. They didn't even show compassion on that situation. All they wanted to do was, "Why are you carrying your bed and who made you do it?" Their priorities were in the wrong place. And that is exactly what Jesus wanted to confront. He wanted to point out the folly in their beliefs because he knew that this distortion of the meaning and purpose behind the Sabbath was holding people prisoner. This was not a standalone point for Jesus either. If we read the Gospels, we realize his confrontation of the rules around the Sabbath was one of the central themes of Jesus' ministry. On another occasion, we see Jesus dealing with this when we read of a situation where he and his disciples are just walking through a field, get a little bit hungry, and they notice, the grain is ripe. So they just pluck a couple of heads, and they just chew on that. I mean, they're hungry. That's what any of us would do. And the Pharisees who observe that are incensed. They're angry. They're furious that they're doing work. Think about that. They're just walking through a field and plucking a head of grain and eating it. And they're more worried about them violating the Sabbath by plucking a head of grain than they are showing compassion about the fact that these men were hungry. I mean, how messed up is this whole situation? That instead of showing compassion in people's situations, the leaders are more worried about the letter of the law. So we see that in this story, and we see it in our story of the healing of this man. Jesus says it like this in Mark chapter 2, but he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry? He and those with him, how he went into the house of God and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him." And then Jesus said this, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." Jesus wanted to change the paradigm. If we look closely at this throughout his ministry, many of the miracles that he performed were on the Sabbath. So what he's trying to do here is not just show the compassion for the one, be it healing or raising somebody from the dead or providing wisdom or teaching. He's not just concerned with the compassion for the one, but he always tends to do it on the Sabbath because he's showing his compassion for the many. He, out of anybody, understood the power of religion. How it can hold us back and restrain our souls. It can keep us captive instead of allowing for the freedom that God had always designed, that God had always wanted for each and every one of us. And so Jesus knew he needed to deal with the grip of religion, and he had to replace it with the compassion of relationship. Jesus' ultimate purpose was one of restoration, to reestablish that relationship between God and humanity that had been lost because of sin. Every part of his ministry, every teaching, every miracle was designed with the purpose and intent of removing these religious barriers, to help everyone understand what the old covenant was meant to show all the way along, what the law was meant to point to, and that is that a loving God desired relationship with his people. And that the Old Testament, through its prophecies, pointed to the Messiah being Jesus, and that was the fulfillment of the law, that relationship was the intention, that relationship was the point. And every sign we see in John points to the fact that Jesus was God's Son, and that his death on the cross created for each of us a way to be in relationship with God the Father, a loving God. Many of us are already on that journey with him. But if you've never had that opportunity to take that step into relationship with Jesus Christ, I would encourage you to do that today. To look at the stories we see here in John and realize that Jesus is in fact who he said he was. That he was the Son of God and that he came for all mankind. The Bible tells us that for us to receive that gift, all we have to do is confess that we've sinned, which means that we've done wrong. To admit that God is in fact who he says he was, and to invite him in, and we enter into relationship. It's such an amazing, simple process. And so what we have for you is, if that is something you want to do, is that something you have maybe questions about? Maybe you're not quite sure of what that really entails. We want to encourage you to do one of two things. One is to join us at our yes table over here on my right at the end of the service. And we'll have a volunteer there to be able to answer any questions you might have about what this looks like. What is a relationship? What Jesus is all about? The other thing is if you want to look at taking the next steps, if you want to know a little bit more about what it is to be in relationship with Jesus, we have a course here at the church called Changed. If you're looking for information on that, it's in your programs on the inside on the bottom right-hand corner. You can contact Pastor Sherry to get more information about that class. And it really teaches you what this relationship with Jesus is all about. And I'd encourage you to do that today, because that's the whole point of it all, is this relationship. And Jesus, by confronting the religious leaders about the Sabbath, he was trying to help them understand that the rules weren't meant to control people, that the rules weren't meant to contain people, but instead, they were meant to help us focus on the right things in life. God knew how easy it is for us to be busy, how easy it is for us to get distracted and to be caught up in the pace of life. And here he is setting aside time for us because he knew it was important for us to slow down, to rest, to focus on the right things in life. First and foremost, to focus on God and to slow down enough for us to hear what he's saying, to give him opportunity to speak into moments in our life when we need healing. Maybe there's an area of growth But more than that, after we've put God first and foremost, it's then to take time and to value what is important. To slow down enough to value our marriages, to value our children, to value our neighbors, our community, our friends and family. Sometimes we get so busy that we just assume everything's going to stay the same and we don't invest into these relationships. And Jesus is telling us, no, relationship is the point. Not just with me, but with everyone else. And we need to slow down enough to see what Jesus is saying, and beyond that, to do what he did and to show compassion for all of us. Because in this, Jesus showed compassion by teaching us what really was important. There's the old phrase in Christianity, it's not about religion, it's about relationship. How many of you have heard that one before? If you've been in church a while, you'll know, oh, don't worry, it's not about religion, it's about relationship. Sometimes it seems a little weird, but the fact of the matter is that statement is true. That's what this is all about. It's about relationship. It's about going beyond just religious practice. It's about truly knowing Jesus, knowing God the Father, and how much he loves us. And think about how easy it is for us to get caught up in the trappings of life, in the trap of religious thinking. I mean, that could be as simple as what the Bible refers to as idolatry. Now, all idolatry is putting anything before God. That could be our time. That could be certain possessions. That could be our money. Anything that is higher than God in our lives is an idol. And Jesus is coming into this situation and saying, no, I need to be first and foremost. Jesus was going, and this just blows my mind, he's going to his own people. He's going to the ones that should have been the most ready for the Messiah. They had the prophecies. They were looking for him. And yet, after 3 years of incredible ministry, countless miracles, life and world-changing teaching, where we saw thousands and thousands of people gathered to him just to hear what he was going to say, he goes to the cross. And the Bible tells us that there were only 600 followers left. Where was everybody else? Thousands and thousands of people enthralled with Jesus, and Jesus goes to the cross, the very point of why he came. And he rises, and he's got 600 left. You'd think there'd be more. But it's why it was so important for Jesus to confront the religious authority, to confront things like the Sabbath, because he understood that the grip of religion ultimately holds us back from Jesus. All of those other people that had heard Jesus, had seen or heard of the miracles, had been there when he was there, were too scared to take that step in. And we even see it in our own story. This guy gets healed and he's confronted by the religious authorities, and they say, "Who made you take up your bed?" And he's like, "I don't know." And Jesus goes to the temple. He finds him. And we're going to get to that part of the story in just a second. But he goes to the temple. He finds him. And what does the guy do? He immediately goes to the Jewish high leaders and says it was Jesus. He points him out, says he's the one that did it. Because he was scared of the religious authority. He didn't see what Jesus was trying to do. And Jesus here showed compassion for the one by creating a way. He created a way for that man on that day, and he created a way for each of us at the cross to enter into relationship with him. Jesus had compassion for the many and that he wanted to break the hold of religion. And we see this summed up so clearly at the end of our story when John continues in verse 14. He said, afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you." You see, Jesus not only healed this man and showing compassion for the one when he did, but he engaged with him afterwards to ensure that his healing was from the inside out. Jesus wasn't just concerned about his physical state. He was concerned with his eternal destiny, his standing with God. Today, Jesus has the same compassion and concern for each of us. He is as concerned about our soul as he is with our physical needs. Jesus said in Luke 19:10, "For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." That is the meaning behind every sign that we see in the book of John. Every story conveys the fact that Jesus came for that very purpose. And Jesus' compassion is offered to each of us today. It's why he beckons us not only into relationship with him, but into a deeper level of relationship. He has a desire to work in and through our lives, but it is driven out of love and compassion, and he offers it freely. As we saw in our story, he intentionally went to the pool of Bethesda. He didn't have to go there. He could have gone through the main gates, but instead he chose to go somewhere where it was difficult. And he then showed later in his life the same focus, the same intentionality, the same purpose when he went to the cross for each and every one of us. And that is what is extended to all of us today. He asks us to lay down those things that are holding us back, whether that's holding us back from entering into relationship with him, or whether it's something that's holding us back from going deeper, from learning more, to listening to his call upon our lives, to maybe receiving the wisdom for our circumstance. Maybe it's holding us back from accepting his love because there are areas in our life that we think are unlovable. But that's not what this is about. It's about Jesus saying, let's remove those barriers. Let's push the religion aside. Let's push aside any hindrance. We need to accept the compassion that he offers today, to see the sign and to allow Jesus to love us, to truly love us from the inside out, to change us, to grow us, to deepen that level of relationship. Would you stand with me today? We're going to take a moment to pray. But as we do, I want each of us to take a moment to pause. So as I'm praying, I am going to stop talking for a few seconds, and I want each of us to take that moment, to take that opportunity in the midst of our busyness, and to ask God, what is it that is holding me back? What is it that you're asking me to rise from, to take up and to walk? What is my bed? What is my barrier? Let's pray. God, I thank you, God, for your compassion and love. God, your desire to be in relationship with each and every one of us. God, it is so amazing to see that intentionality in everything that you did. Your teachings, your miracles. And so, God, we come before you right now, God, and we know that no matter where we are in our relationship with you, God, whether it's new or whether we've been doing it for 38 years or longer, God, we know that you're always calling us to a place of deeper relationship. And so today, God, reveal to us through your Holy Spirit those things that are holding us back, those things that are causing us to pause, those things that have been a barrier. And God, help us to understand, God, that when we take those things, God, and we give them to you, God, that you work all things together for good. Just reveal to us now, God. God, as we go from this place today, let us follow your compassionate instruction to rise, to take up, and to walk into new places of blessing, abundance, healing, wisdom. God, because in relationship with you, the impossible becomes possible. So we give it all to you right now in the mighty and powerful name of Jesus, who did this all for us.